She was blind, forgotten, and 15, left behind like baggage no one claimed. He was a quiet rancher who'd lost everything but his faith. Neither was looking for love, but God had other plans. The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days. Not the heavy kind that thrashed and howled, but the soft, steady kind that soaked deep and made the earth heavy with grief. It slid down warped windows, pattered against worn hats, and dripped from the rusted gutter above the orphanage steps. No one noticed the girl sitting beneath it. No one except the dog tied nearby, and even he had more shelter than she did. Her name was Clara. She was 15, though she looked younger, her small frame made smaller by the damp dress that clung to her like a second skin. Her shoes were mismatched, one heel broken. Her eyes, though open, stared ahead at nothing. Milky white, unfocused, blind since birth. A burden from the moment she'd cried, her mother said once. At least until her mother stopped saying anything at all. They had sent her away after the funeral. Too many mouths to feed, not enough hands to work. And now the orphanage, after barely a month, was sending her away again. They said the money ran out, said she was nearly grown, said she'd figure it out. They said a lot of things. But no one came back to get her. So she sat in the rain, palms pressed to the cold stone of the steps, lips slightly parted like she was listening for someone, anyone, to say her name. The wagon had already pulled away, its wooden wheels sucking through the mud. Doors slammed shut inside the building. The last hour had passed in silence. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She simply waited. It was nearly dark when the sound came, hooves in the slush, slow and steady. A man's voice called out to someone she couldn't see. No reply. Clara turned her head, not because she knew who it was, but because it was the first voice that hadn't cursed or ignored her. The boot stopped near her, close enough she could feel the presence. There was silence for a long while, broken only by the hiss of rain and the jingle of a bridle. "You waiting for someone?" The voice was deep, not unkind. She tilted her head slightly. "No, sir." "Then why are you still sitting there?" "They told me to." He said nothing for so long she wondered if he'd left. Then a warm hand, calloused, broad, brushed rain from her forehead. "Can you stand?" She hesitated. "Yes." "Then let's get you out of the wet." Clara didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask where they were going. When you've been forgotten by the world, you learn not to question kindness, just to hold it tight before it disappears. He lifted her gently, one arm beneath her legs, the other behind her shoulders. She stiffened only a moment, unused to being touched like she mattered, then let herself rest against the beat of his heart. "Name S. Silas," he said after a long while. "Silas Beck." She nodded once. "Clara." The name felt like a secret in her mouth. No one had asked for it in weeks. He didn't speak again until they reached the wagon. He wrapped her in a thick wool coat that smelled of smoke and pine. Then he helped her sit beside him, reins loose in his hands as the horse began its slow walk down the muddy lane. "I ain't got much," he said. "Cabin's quiet, not much to see." She smiled faintly. "That's all right, I can't see anyhow." He grunted softly, not laughing at her but not pitying either. That silence, that rare, warm kind, lasted all the way back to his land. The cabin was small, set deep into the hillside, hidden by tall grass and twisted pines. Clara couldn't see it, but she could smell the clean timber, the chimney smoke, hear the groan of a front door that hadn't been used in too long. He helped her inside, set her down near the hearth. The fire was weak but real. The floorboards creaked beneath his steps. "You cold?" "A little." "I'll fix that." He added wood to the flames, then hung a kettle. She listened as he moved each sound like a map in her mind. Chair sliding, boots on stone, a cupboard opening. "You hungry?" She nodded. He placed something warm in her hands, a mug of broth. Her fingers curled around it instinctively. They didn't speak again until she finished it. "Why'd you take me?" she asked softly, the words almost swallowed by the crackle of fire. He didn't answer right away, then low and honest. "Because I know what it feels like to be left, and because God don't give us grief for nothing." Her throat tightened. She wanted to cry then, but she didn't. She hadn't let herself cry since the day her sister walked away and didn't come back, but something about the way he said it, the weight, the truth, unlocked the part of her that had stayed closed for too long. The tears came silent and slow. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stirred the fire and let her cry. When she finally whispered, "Thank you," he only nodded. The next day began before the frost melted. Silas didn't wake her, just left a folded blanket near the fire, bread on the table. Clara found it by smell and touch. She sat on the floor to eat it, afraid to sit in a chair without knowing how far she'd fall. Later he returned, voice gentle. "You feel up to moving around some. I'll show you the place." "I can't see." "You can still know it." So she took his arm and he walked her through the house, naming each space: stove, table, cupboard, back door. She ran her fingers along the walls, memorizing knots in the wood. Outside, he let her feel the fence, the pump, the porch rail smooth from weather. She listened to the sounds: chickens clucking, a breeze moving through the grass, a creak in the distance. When they returned inside, she asked, "Why's it so quiet?" His answer was slow. "My wife's buried out back. We couldn't have children. She always wanted a girl." Clara said nothing, but her fingers curled slightly around his sleeve, and he didn't move away. That night she dreamed of laughter, of voices calling her name. She woke to the smell of biscuits and the sound of Silas humming low near the stove. For the first time in her life, Clara Wren began to believe she wasn't alone. The third morning at Silas Beck's ranch began with soft rain tapping on the roof and the smell of damp earth rising through the cracked windows. Clara lay wrapped in quilts by the fire, listening. She could hear him moving, boots scuffing on wood, a door creaking open and then shut, the quiet clang of a pan set on the stove. No words yet. Silas didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. She liked that. Clara sat up slowly, fingers brushing the edge of the blanket until she found her shoes. She'd lined them beside her bedroll the night before, careful to remember their direction. Blindness hadn't made her helpless, it had made her deliberate. Every motion held meaning. Every step demanded trust. She crossed the small room to the table and waited. Silas turned at the sound and handed her a plate. One biscuit, half an apple, and a bit of jam he'd scraped from the bottom of a jar. She held it with both hands, sat down with a nod, and ate in silence. He finally said, "We'll head to town today." Her chewing slowed. "Why?" "Supplies, maybe a coat that fits you." Clara hesitated. "You don't have to spend money on me." Silas leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "I don't spend where I don't see worth, Clara. You're under my roof. You'll be warm." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all. By midday, the wagon was hitched. Silas led her by the arm, steady and patient as ever, guiding her up onto the seat. It took them nearly 2 hours to reach town. The ride was quiet but not cold. Silas didn't fill space with useless talk. He pointed out things she couldn't see, told her when the wind changed, when the creek curved. She listened with the same intensity she'd used her whole life. That's how she remembered people, by their pauses, their tones, the way their footsteps sounded different on gravel than on wood. When they rolled into town, she knew from the shift in sound. More boots, more voices, a blacksmith hammering metal into submission. Silas helped her down carefully. "Stay close." He didn't say it like a command, more like a tether of protection, not control. She followed the sound of his boots, one hand brushing against the back of his coat. They walked into a general store where the air smelled like flour and lamp oil. The floorboards groaned under weight, and Clara could feel eyes on her, curious, maybe a little suspicious. Small towns didn't take kindly to unfamiliar shadows. A blind girl clinging to a man who hadn't been seen with company in years. That was more than gossip. That was wildfire. The shopkeeper's voice came slow. "Mornin', Silas, wasn't expectin' you." Silas's tone was flat. "Need a coat, some boots, she's with me." Clara tilted her face down, hiding behind her hair. The man asked nothing more. Footsteps padded off, boxes shifted. Silas didn't fill the silence. Clara stood still until the man returned, draping a heavy wool coat over her shoulders and gently pressing boots into her hands. She tried them on. They fit. "Put it on my account," Silas said. "No trouble," the man replied, though it was clear he'd talk the second they were gone. They walked out into light rain again. Clara whispered, "People are staring." "I know. Because I'm blind." "No," he said, "because they've forgotten what it looks like to help without asking for something back." They rode home in silence. Clara didn't ask questions, but her hands held tighter to the reins. The next few weeks unfolded like pages in a slow, quiet book. Clara learned the ranch by heart. She knew how many steps to the pump, where the firewood was stacked, where the gate creaked on its hinge. She fed the chickens by feel, helped grind oats. She couldn't lift a barrel, but she could sew a rip in a shirt, bake cornbread by smell alone. She and Silas talked little, but when they did, it mattered. One evening by the fire she asked, "Did you ever want children?" He stirred the coals with an iron rod. "Yeah." "What stopped you?" Silence. Then slowly, "God did." He stood before she could speak, walked outside into the chill. She sat alone, trying to piece together the edges of that answer. Later, when he came back, he knelt beside the hearth and said, "My wife carried 3, lost all 3. We stopped trying after the last." Clara reached out, her hand brushing his sleeve. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He didn't move away. From that night forward, something softened between them. Not love, not yet, but something like shelter, like breath after drowning. Then late one afternoon, the first real test came. Silas had gone to check the fence line. Clara sat mending a sock near the hearth when the knock came. 3 sharp raps on the front door. She froze. Another knock, harder. She didn't move. The door creaked open. Rain thudded harder on the roof. A voice, slick and lazy, spoke into the room. "Well now, ain't this a cozy sight?" Clara stood slowly, sock forgotten. "Who's there?" she asked, voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. Bootsteps crossed the floor. "I'm lookin' for Silas Beck." "He's not here." "That's so?" The voice was closer now. "And who might you be, sittin' pretty in his chair?" She took a step back, heartbeat loud in her ears. "A friend," she said. The man laughed. It was a mean sound. "Silas don't make friends." Before she could speak again, a second voice rang out, low and furious. She said, "I'm not here." Clara turned toward the sound. Silas stood in the doorway, soaked to the skin, rifle slung across one shoulder. The stranger didn't flinch. Didn't mean trouble, just heard you taken in some company. Silas stepped forward. "You've heard enough, get off my land." The man hesitated. "I said now." The door slammed, silence returned. Clara stood shaking near the hearth. Silas crossed to her and gently touched her elbow. "You all right?" She nodded, but her knees gave out. He caught her before she hit the floor, cradled her like a child, carried her to the chair. He didn't ask why she was trembling, didn't press. Later by the fire she said, "That man, he knew you." "From before." "Before what?" He paused. "Before I stopped letting people in." She touched his arm again. "Why did you let me in?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "Because you weren't looking for a way out, just a place to stay." And she realized then, so was he. The next morning the sun rose without rain for the first time in weeks. Silas helped Clara outside. She stood on the porch, wind in her hair, face tilted toward the warmth. She whispered, "I can feel it." "What?" "The light." Silas looked at her a long time. "So can I." The days after the stranger's visit shifted the air around the ranch, like the first warning crack of a branch before the tree gives way. Silas didn't speak of it again, but Clara could feel it in the way he moved, more cautious, more alert. The rifle stayed propped by the door now, not just leaned casually in the corner. He began making more rounds around the property, and his silences became heavier, not cold, just weighed down with a history she couldn't see. But Clara didn't ask. She had learned a long time ago that some wounds needed space before they could be spoken of. Instead, she stayed busy, busier than he probably expected. She swept the cabin each morning, mended what needed mending, learned to knead bread by touch, and counted the animals' feed by weight in her palm. The ranch began to feel like more than safety. It began to feel like rhythm. She even started humming again, little tunes under her breath when she thought she was alone, old songs from before the orphanage, back when her mother's voice had been the soundtrack to every day. She didn't tell Silas that. Then came the letter. Clara was rinsing out a rag by the pump when she heard the sound of hooves and wagon wheels. It wasn't uncommon. Silas had occasional deliveries brought from the store, but this one came with voices. Men, more than one. She stood frozen, water dripping from her hands until Silas came out of the barn, a long shadow moving steady toward the gate. She counted 3 men, one older with a stained coat and tobacco-stained fingers, another lanky with a sharp mouth that never quite closed, and the third, a boy, really, no older than 17, trying to look brave with a rifle that was too big for him. "Silas Beck," the older one asked. Silas gave a nod. "We come from Dillingham, name's Harper. These here's my boys, got a letter for you." Clara couldn't see the gesture, but she could hear the sound of paper rustling. She stepped closer to the cabin door, not inside, not out, just listening. "From Judge Whitley's clerk. Says you're to appear in town within 5 days. Matter of claim on the property your brother left. It's contested." Silas didn't answer. The younger voice spoke. "Ain't you got nothing to say?" Silas said, "I didn't know he died." "Died last week, fever." Silence. "Guess that means you're the only one left," Harper said. "But word is, a cousin down from Abilene's claimin' the deed was rewritten. Says you forfeited rights when you walked away." More silence. "Anyway," the man added almost cheerfully, "you'll want to get a move on. Judge won't wait long, 5 days. Boot steps a spit, and then the wagon rolled away. Clara heard Silas walk to the porch. She waited for him to say something. He didn't. "Silas?" she asked softly, stepping toward him. He sat down hard on the bench, elbows on his knees. "I had a brother. I gathered that." "David." He said the name like it was a stone in his throat. "We were young when we split. He stayed. I left. Thought I was leaving all that behind." "Why did you leave?" He didn't answer. She sat beside him, carefully, quietly. After a long pause, he said, "There was a fire. Burned our folks' barn down, horses, everything. I blamed him. He blamed me. Truth is, might have been both of us, or neither." Clara waited. "I thought maybe I could start over. Then I met Sarah. Thought that was my clean slate. But we didn't get the children we prayed for, and then I lost her too." Clara felt the air shift. "Sometimes I think I was meant to be alone," he murmured. "Every time I reach out, the Lord just closes the door again." "No," Clara said, soft but steady. "Sometimes the Lord doesn't close the door. He just asks you to wait by it longer than you want to." Silas looked at her. She couldn't see it, but she felt his eyes on her. And then, slowly, he nodded. "I need to ride into town," he said, "tomorrow." "I'll be all right here," she said quickly. "You'll come with me." Clara turned to him, surprised. "Why?" His voice was firm, "Because I won't leave you behind." That night they packed lightly, just enough for the trip: bread, dried meat, a flask of coffee. Clara rolled her few clothes into a bundle, while Silas checked and rechecked his saddlebag. Neither of them slept much. She could hear him pacing in the other room, his boots soft against the wood, pausing now and then like a man fighting something unseen. They left before first light. The town was nearly 2 days' ride from the ranch, but Silas pushed the horses hard and they made it by sundown. Clara could tell by the sudden rise of voices, the clang of iron, the sharp sense of people, sweat, horses, smoke, a storm of sound and smell. She stayed close to him, her hand on his arm as they walked down the muddy street. The courthouse sat like a stern judge itself, tall, stiff, unwelcoming. Inside they sat on a hard bench. The hearing wasn't until morning. Silas stared straight ahead for hours, until Clara touched his hand. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. He looked at her, and for the first time his voice cracked. "I think I've done everything alone." She didn't say anything, just laced her fingers with his. The next morning they entered the courtroom. Clara sat silently at the back while Silas stood before the judge, broad-shouldered, straight-backed, quiet as always. He spoke when spoken to, answered with clarity, no bitterness, no drama. The other claimant, a cousin Silas barely remembered, argued harder, louder, slinging half-truths like stones. But Silas stood still, like a tree refusing to bend. After 2 hours, the judge called a recess. They sat on the steps outside, Clara with her face lifted to the sun, Silas leaning into the shadows of the overhang. "They won't give it to me," he said, like it was already decided. "You don't know that. They think men like me don't deserve to come back and claim what they left. You didn't leave it, you left pain, that's different." He turned toward her. "Why do you believe in me?" She didn't hesitate. "Because you believed in me first." The judge returned that afternoon with a ruling. "The land," he said, "stays with Silas Beck." A hush fell over the room. Outside, the cousin cursed under his breath and walked off without a glance back. Silas stood there, unmoving. When Clara reached for his arm, she felt him trembling. "Let's go home," he said. But on the way back, just miles from the ranch, something shifted in the wind. Smoke. They rounded the bend, and Clara felt it before she heard him curse under his breath. The barn, his barn, was on fire. Flames snapped like wild animals, red against the twilight. Silas leapt off the wagon and ran, but it was already half gone. Horses whinnied in panic. He dashed inside and came out choking, dragging 2 bridles and a saddle. "Clara," he shouted, "stay back." She stumbled from the wagon, following his voice, holding her skirts as she moved toward the crackle of fire. "Who did this?" she called. He didn't answer. She reached the porch just as he did. The cabin was untouched, but barely. Smoke curled from the edges of the barn roof as it collapsed with a groan. Silas dropped to his knees in the dirt, hands pressed into the ground, breath heaving like a man drowned and dragged back out again. Clara knelt beside him, placed her hand on his back. "Whoever did this," he said, "wasn't just trying to scare me." "Then we don't let them win," Clara said. "We rebuild." He looked at her, eyes full of something between grief and awe. And in that moment, something else burned besides the barn, something deeper. Not anger, not loss. Something like belonging. The fire left behind more than ash. The smell of smoke clung to everything, his coat, her dress, even the blankets inside the cabin. Silas worked the next day with his jaw set like stone, eyes hollowed by lack of sleep. He barely spoke, and when he did, the words were clipped, mechanical. But Clara didn't ask questions. She just worked beside him. They salvaged what they could from the barn: charred beams, bent nails, a few unburned boards that had been damp enough to survive. The horses had been spared only because Silas had kept them in the far corral for grazing. But supplies, tools, harnesses, all gone. Clara didn't say much, but in the quiet she watched him. Watched the way he carried the weight alone, like he didn't think he was allowed to share it. He wouldn't meet her gaze when she passed him the hammer or when her fingers brushed his as they sifted through rubble. There was shame in him, and something worse, grief that had no name and no end. That night, after hours of hauling and lifting, Silas sat at the edge of the porch, staring out into the blackness. The stars above were faint, barely visible through a haze of leftover smoke. Clara brought him a tin cup of warm water and sat beside him without speaking. Her fingers, bandaged from a splinter earlier, rested gently against her skirt. After a long while he spoke. "They did this to punish me." "Who?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her. The man who came to the ranch before, with the threat in his voice and the quiet in his eyes. That was a warning. I didn't heed it. So now they've taken what they think matters most. "You're wrong," Clara said. He turned his head, brows furrowed. "They didn't take what matters most. You're still standing. The horses are still alive. And this," she placed her hand over his chest, not quite touching, just hovering above his shirt, "this is still beating." He looked down at her hand, then at her face. "You don't understand." "No," she agreed. "I don't. I don't know what it's like to lose everything over and over, but I do know what it's like to be afraid to start again." He looked away. She continued, quieter now. "In the orphanage, we weren't allowed to hope for things. Hope got girls in trouble. Hope made you weak. But then I met someone who gave me a chance without asking what I could give back. He just let me exist, safely, fully." Silas's breath hitched. "I don't know how to be that man." "You already are." They sat in silence, broken only by the distant groan of settling timbers from the barn's remains. Eventually, Silas stood and offered her his hand. She took it without hesitation, and they went inside. Days passed. The rebuilding began slowly, with no extra hands and no money to hire them. Clara insisted on helping. She hauled wood, hammered nails, and even helped Silas rework the fencing around the paddocks. They worked until their muscles burned, and the sun was nothing but a smear behind them. But something shifted between them. It was in the way he handed her tools without needing to ask. In the way she caught him watching her when she was turned slightly away, her hair coming loose in the wind. It was in the quiet moments at the end of each day when they sat close beside the fire, not speaking, just breathing the same space, as though the silence had become a kind of language only they understood. One afternoon, Clara stumbled while carrying a beam. Her foot caught on a stone and she went down hard. Silas was at her side in seconds, his hands on her shoulders, his voice laced with worry. "Are you hurt?" She winced but shook her head. "Just scraped, my pride more than anything." He brushed dirt from her sleeve, and when his fingers lingered just a second too long, she didn't pull away. "I should have been watching," he muttered. "You were," she said, "just not the way you think." He looked up at her then, really looked, and for the first time since they'd met, Clara saw something open in his expression. Vulnerability, and something else, need. The moment held. Then a distant sound broke it, hooves again. They both froze. Silas stood, eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively reaching toward the rifle by the cabin's wall. Clara rose beside him, brushing her hands clean against her skirt. A rider approached, this one older, not the same man from before. His clothes were cleaner, his posture stiffer, but something about him felt familiar. "Mr. Beck," the man called as he neared. Silas stepped forward. "That's me." The man stopped his horse, dismounted slowly, and pulled something from his coat, an envelope thick, sealed with red wax. "Name's Garvey. I'm a solicitor for the Hartford estate. Got reason to believe you're in possession of something that don't rightly belong to you." Silas didn't move. "What's that?" "The girl," the man said, nodding toward Clara. "She's been claimed by blood. Her uncle's filed petition." Clara's heart stopped. "What uncle?" she whispered. The man turned to her. Name S. Bryce Fenwick. Says you're his brother's daughter, that you disappeared after your mother died. He's looking to take you back into the family. Clara shook her head. I don't have family. You do now, the man replied, and he's willing to come collect you. Silas stepped between them, his tone low but firm. She's not a possession. No, the man said, but the law sees it different. She's not of age, he's kin. That gives him right to file. Clara turned to Silas, panic rising in her throat. I don't know this man. I've never heard his name before. Please, don't let them take me. You have 3 days, Garvey said, handing over the paper, to appear in the magistrate's office, or he comes here with a marshal. He mounted again, tipped his hat like that made it better, and rode off. Silas stood there, the envelope clutched in his hand, until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Clara turned away, pressing her hands against her face. He didn't speak. I'm not going, she whispered. I'd rather run than go with someone I don't know, someone who only wants me now when it suits him. Silas's voice was low, gravel-thick. You don't have to go. But if we fight this, she began. He cut her off. Then we fight it. The next day was quiet but not peaceful. Silas spent most of it inside the cabin, reading the letter over and over, running his hand through his hair in frustration. Clara tried to busy herself, but her fingers trembled and her chest felt too tight. She thought of the darkness behind her eyelids, of the silence that used to follow her everywhere, of being passed from place to place like someone's burden. Then that night, Silas brought her a small wooden box. I meant to give you this before, he said, but it never seemed the right time. Inside was a locket, oval gold, worn. She opened it and felt her breath catch. Inside was a tiny sketch, rough but careful. It was her, and beside it another sketch. A woman, eyes gentle, mouth kind. Your wife? Clara asked. He nodded. She used to draw. I kept one for myself. And the one of me. I did that, he admitted, almost shyly. You sat on the porch one day humming to yourself. I remembered it later. She blinked fast, throat thick. Why? Because, he said, you were the first sound of peace this place has had in a long time. And for a long while neither spoke. Because sometimes love doesn't begin with a kiss or a confession. Sometimes it begins with silence, with the choice to stay, with the sketch of a face tucked into a locket alongside the one who came before. And sometimes the heart is big enough for both. The next morning dawned gray and restless. A fine mist clung to the fields like it didn't know whether it wanted to become rain or disappear. Silas didn't sleep. Neither did Clara. They sat in the quiet kitchen, barely touching their coffee, the letter from the solicitor laid between them on the table like a loaded pistol. You don't have to go, Silas said again, but his voice lacked conviction now. Not because he'd changed his mind, but because he feared the law wouldn't care what she wanted. Clara stared at the letter. I don't know him. I don't remember an uncle, if he even is one. What if he just wants to control me? Silas ran a hand over his beard. That's what scares me. They didn't speak of the locket, of the look they'd shared when she opened it, of the hours afterward where neither of them moved far from the other, but the air between them had changed. It was no longer just familiarity. It was choice. She stayed close to him that day, not with fear but with purpose. She helped him repair the hinges on the barn door and swept the porch with steady strokes. At one point, she paused beside him and asked softly, What happens if we don't go to that hearing? He looked down at her, eyes unreadable. Then he comes here with a marshal. He'll have legal authority to take you by force if we can't prove your claim or show just cause. And if I run? His jaw tightened. Then you'll be hunted like a fugitive, and I. She turned. What? He looked away. I couldn't let you go alone, not again. The words hung between them like a vow, but it wasn't just about protection anymore. Clara knew that. She felt it in the way his hand lingered too long when he passed her tools, in the way his gaze softened whenever she laughed, and she saw it most clearly in how he avoided talking about her leaving, because even the thought tore at something deep in him. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She simply stood beside him until the sky turned gold and the day wore thin. But by late afternoon the unease returned. A dust cloud on the horizon signaled riders, 2 of them. Clara's hand instinctively reached for Silas's arm. He watched the riders approach, lips pressed into a grim line. No need to guess who they were. Marshal Kane was known in 3 counties. He rode with a straight spine and a brimmed hat pulled low. Beside him sat Bryce Fenwick, the supposed uncle. His clothes were sharp, boots polished. He had the kind of face that smiled like it was pulling something behind it. They didn't dismount at first, just waited until Silas stepped off the porch and Clara stood behind him. "Afternoon," the marshal called. Silas said nothing. Fenwick took off his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Clara," he said smoothly, "you're a hard girl to find." She didn't respond. The marshal cleared his throat. "We've come on legal grounds. Mr. Fenwick here has filed guardianship over his blood kin." "I'm not his kin," Clara said. "Paperwork says otherwise," Fenwick replied, holding up documents she couldn't read from the distance. Silas took a step forward. "You'll not take her unless the court says so." "You didn't show at the hearing," the marshal said flatly. "Because we were building back a barn someone else burned down," Silas returned. "Convenient timing." Fenwick's smile faltered. "Now let's not make this unpleasant. She's young, needs guidance, can't just be wandering ranches with strangers." "I'm not wandering," Clara snapped. "I live here." "Clara," the marshal said, "I'm not here to argue, but if you resist, you force my hand." She felt her knees weaken. She gripped the porch railing and tried to stand taller. "I want to stay," she said. "And she will," Silas said behind her. The marshal sighed and dismounted. "Let's talk inside." Clara and Silas led them in. Fenwick didn't stop looking around, his gaze flitting over the worn table, the mended curtains, the clean hearth. He looked like a man appraising a purchase he hadn't decided to make. "Why now?" Silas asked. "Why show up after all this time?" Fenwick leaned back. "My brother, her father, died owing me debts. I've taken responsibility for her well-being." "And the newborn she carried," Silas pressed. "No mention of him in your claims. Doesn't suit your image, does it?" Clara's face went pale. "You knew." "I've read the documents," Silas said softly. "The midwife that helped, the child that passed." She blinked hard. "I buried him myself." Marshal Kane exhaled slowly. "The law cares about one thing: blood. If this man's her kin and she's underage, she falls under his care unless married or formally adopted." Silas looked at Clara. "Then we fix that." The room fell silent. Clara turned to him, eyes wide. "What?" He didn't hesitate. "We marry." Fenwick let out a sharp laugh. "You're not serious." "I am," Silas said without blinking. Kane scratched his jaw. "It changes the situation if she agrees." All eyes turned to Clara. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. "You do that?" she asked Silas. "I'd do anything to keep you safe," he replied. She swallowed. "Even if you never love me." "I already do." The truth hung naked in the air. No ceremony, no declaration, just a fact laid bare. Clara stepped forward, eyes shining. "Then yes." Kane nodded slowly. "I can officiate right here, civil union." Fenwick rose from his seat. "This is a mockery." Silas turned to him. "No, this is a home, and she chooses to stay." It was done in minutes. Clara's fingers trembled as she held Silas's hands, but when the words were said, and Kane declared them husband and wife, a peace washed over her like warm water after a lifetime of cold. Fenwick stormed out without a word. Kane stayed long enough to sign the documents, then he tipped his hat. "You're good folk, I hope you find peace." When the riders disappeared over the ridge, Clara sat on the porch steps, breathless. Silas sat beside her. "You meant it?" she asked. He didn't speak, just took her hand. "I never thought I'd belong anywhere," she whispered. "You do now," he said. "You're home." They stayed there until stars pricked the sky. Two silent souls who had once lived in shadows, now married not by obligation but by choice, not by ceremony but by promise. And behind them, inside the cabin, the fire never burned brighter. It didn't feel real the next morning. Clara woke in the same bed she had for weeks now, with sunlight spilling faintly across the wall from the kitchen window. The air smelled like coffee and wood smoke. The old rocking chair beside the stove creaked gently. Silas was already up, moving through his morning tasks with the same quiet rhythm he always had. But something had shifted between them, not in words, but in presence. She lay still a moment longer, her hand resting on the simple gold band now encircling her finger. It wasn't polished, wasn't new. It had once belonged to Silas's late wife. He'd told her quietly the night before. And yet, as Clara held her hand up to the early light, the ring didn't feel like something borrowed. It felt earned. She rose without a sound and stepped into the kitchen where Silas looked up from the stove and gave her a quiet nod. "Coffee." She nodded, unable to say anything for a moment. The house was warm, and her voice felt like it might shatter something delicate. He poured the cup, set it on the table, and then returned to flipping cornbread in the skillet. The children would be waking soon, but for now it was just them. "Do you regret it?" she asked finally. Silas turned the last piece over and shook his head. "Not for a second." She didn't answer, just sat there watching the back of the man who had risked everything to protect her again. It still didn't make sense why he had chosen her, a blind orphan with nothing but a name and a broken past. But he had. And with that choice he'd given her more than safety. He'd given her a future. Outside, frost still rimmed the fence posts. Winter wasn't done yet. Neither were the storms ahead. But there was warmth in this house that no wind could break. The children woke slowly, rubbing eyes and dragging feet. Jonah was first, padding into the kitchen and stopping short when he saw Clara sitting where his mother used to. She braced herself, but the boy only looked at her for a long moment and then walked over to the table. "Morning, Miss Clara." She smiled, "Just Clara now, or whatever feels right to you." He studied her, then nodded. "Clara." He sat down and reached for the cornbread without hesitation. One by one, the other children joined. Sarah clung to Clara's arm, refusing to sit anywhere else. Levi sat on the floor and leaned against her leg, like he'd done it every day of his life. Even baby Anna, too small to understand any of it, lifted her arms toward Clara from her crib and gurgled with delight when she was picked up. By the time breakfast was finished, Clara's heart ached with something so tender she could hardly breathe. After dishes, Silas showed her the adoption papers. "I started them before," he paused, brow creasing, "before the marriage." Her eyes widened. He looked away. "Didn't want to scare you off, but I wanted to make sure that if something happened to me, you wouldn't be cast out again." "You thought of that?" He nodded. "I've seen too many folks left behind." She took the papers from his hands and held them to her chest. "You are not like other men, Sila's heart." He looked at her then, really looked, and she knew that even though his eyes could no longer see the world the way others did, he saw her, entirely. But peace was never long-lived on the prairie. That afternoon, as Silas walked to town to send the adoption papers through the circuit judge, Clara remained with the children, guiding them through chores with ease now. Her fingers had learned the barn's every creak and corner, and even her steps across the icy yard no longer faltered. The sun was starting to set when she heard hooves. Too fast, too many. Clara stood at the porch, arms wrapped around Sarah and Levi, while Jonah ran to get the rifle. But it wasn't a raiding party, it was Marshal Kane. He dismounted quickly. "Where's Silas?" "Town," Clara said, voice steady though her heart pounded. Kane nodded grimly. "I need you to come with me, now." "Why?" "Bryce Fenwick is dead." The words dropped like a stone in still water. Clara blinked. "What?" Kane looked toward the road. "Shot through the chest, in his hotel room." I don't understand." "You were the last one he filed a complaint about," Kane said carefully. "It's a coincidence, sure, but a loud one. Some folks in town already talking." Clara's knees buckled slightly. "You think I had something to do with it?" "No, but someone might." The children clung to her skirt, wide-eyed and afraid. Kane softened. "I'm not taking you in. I'm taking you to the judge. We're heading him off before someone makes this worse." Clara didn't hesitate. "Jonah, stay with the little ones. Lock the door. Don't open it unless it's your father." "But, please." The boy nodded slowly. Clara followed the marshal to his horse. She didn't even grab a coat, just climbed up and rode, her hands clenched so tightly her fingernails cut into her palms. They reached the circuit judge's quarters at dusk. Silas was already there, tied to a chair, blood on his lip. "What happened?" Clara cried. The judge looked up. "We've had conflicting accounts." "I just came to file the papers," Silas rasped. Then they started shouting. Kane stepped between them. "You're not charging him." The judge raised an eyebrow. "On whose authority?" "On mine," Kane said. "And unless you've got a witness placing either of them at that murder scene, this is a smear job." "They had motive," the judge insisted. "No," Clara said. "He had motive, I had fear." She stepped forward, raising her chin. "You want to know who killed Fenwick? Find out who stood to gain from his death. It wasn't us." The judge stared at her, then at Kane, then at Silas. Finally, he sighed. "You'll be watched." "Fine," Kane said. "But they're not spending the night in a cell for a crime they didn't commit." They rode home under a full moon, the wind cold but the sky clear. Clara leaned against Silas in the saddle. "Did you kill him?" "No," he whispered, "but I'd have stopped him if he tried to take you again." She didn't doubt it, but that wasn't what made her tighten her grip around his waist. What did was the fact that, even in a world where men with power twisted laws to suit themselves, Silas had fought for her with nothing but truth, with faith. When they returned home, the children ran out and flung their arms around both of them, weeping. It was a homecoming, not a fanfare, but of relief. That night Clara sat beside the fire, eyes wide open, no longer afraid of shadows. Silas sat beside her. "Whatever happens next," she whispered, "we face it together." He reached out, took her hand and held it. "Together," he said. And the wind outside could scream all it wanted. The walls of that home would hold. For the next few days, a fragile calm held across the ranch, though underneath it ran the quiet hum of dread neither Clara nor Silas spoke aloud. Clara had returned with Silas from the judge's office without chains, but suspicion still clung like frostbite. The news of Bryce Fenwick's death had spread through town like spilled oil, fast, sticky, and dangerous. And while the sheriff had accepted their alibis for now, Clara knew that peace in these parts was often a shallow promise. Still, the house held together, brick by brick, moment by moment. The children clung to her more tightly now, as if their young hearts knew something had changed. Sarah no longer cried in the middle of the night, but she kept her fingers hooked in Clara's sleeve even in her sleep. Jonah stood watch by the window every evening, the rifle Silas had taught him to load resting across his lap. And little Levi didn't ask questions. He just pressed his head against Clara's ribs when he passed her, like needing to confirm she was still there. Silas tried to pretend it was just another week. He chopped wood with precision, took the wagon into town, even fixed a broken shutter on the barn roof, but Clara could see it. The way his jaw clenched when he thought no one was looking. The stillness in his hands after supper, like he didn't know where to place them anymore. They were waiting, all of them. And the waiting ended 3 days later when a rider came at dusk. Clara saw him from the front porch, just a shadow against the dying light at first, and then a badge glinting faintly on his chest. Not Marshal Kane, a deputy from 2 towns east. He didn't dismount, just pulled the reins and called out in a voice clipped with tension. "Clara Wren." Silas stepped out beside her, towering in silence. Clara answered, "Yes." The deputy held up a folded paper. "Judge Harrow wants to see you, tomorrow, noon." Clara's mouth went dry. "What for?" The man just shrugged. Didn't say, but he said come prepared. Then he turned and rode off without another word, hooves slicing dust from the cold, dried earth. Clara stood still long after the sound faded. Silas didn't touch her, but he was close enough that she could feel the tension in him, like a held breath that might never let go. She turned slowly. "You think he means to arrest me?" Silas shook his head. "I think he's not done trying to." That night Clara couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed, the gold ring on her finger feeling heavier than it ever had. She thought of Fenwick's voice, of how it had crawled down her spine the night he'd grabbed her wrist and whispered that blindness made her easier to tame. She thought of the way Silas had stood in front of her then, silent and unmoving, like a tree against the wind. And then she thought of the man in the hotel room, with a bullet in his chest and a sneer still frozen on his face. Whoever had killed Fenwick hadn't done it in self-defense. They'd done it in anger or revenge. She didn't know whether to be glad he was gone or afraid of what his death might bring. The next morning came too soon. She dressed carefully, tying her hair back with the ribbon Sarah had given her. Jonah tried to come with them. Clara told him no, gently but firmly. "Stay here," she said. "Take care of your sisters. You're the man of the house when we're not home." He stood straighter at that and nodded, though his eyes betrayed the fear he wouldn't voice. The ride to town was silent. Silas kept a steady pace, his hands relaxed on the reins, but Clara saw how he flinched every time another rider passed them. When they reached the courthouse, Judge Harrow was already waiting inside, seated behind a polished desk that looked far too clean for the kind of decisions made there. He didn't offer a greeting, just looked up and nodded to a chair. "Sit." Clara obeyed. "You were at the boarding house the night Fenwick died," he said flatly. Clara nodded. "In the hallway, briefly. I never stepped foot in his room." "I know," the judge said. "We've got witness confirmation of that, but something's changed." Clara's throat went tight. "What?" "Fenwick's brother showed up yesterday. Claims your husband shot Bryce in the dark." Clara's hand gripped the arm of the chair. "He didn't. Silas, he was with me. He was at the clerk's office. There are records." "I know," the judge interrupted, "but that doesn't mean someone else won't try to stir trouble." Clara stared at him, confused. "Then why call me here?" The judge leaned back. "Because there's more than one way to lose your home. Fenwick's brother has money, and money moves things, including land." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there's a petition filed to have your marriage declared invalid. Claims Silas took advantage of a vulnerable woman to cover up a murder." Clara nearly rose from her chair, fury and panic mixing in her chest. "That's not true. None of that is true." "I believe you," the judge said, softer now. "But you need to understand what you're fighting. If they push this in court, they might not win, but they can drag it long enough to wear you out. And in the meantime, they'll poison every well you've tried to drink from." He paused, then slid a folded paper across the desk. "This is a letter from the Fenwick estate. It offers settlement. You take the children, you leave the territory, and they drop the case." Clara stared at the letter like it was made of fire. "I'm not leaving my husband," she said. The judge gave her a tired look. "Then you need to get ready to fight." Silas was waiting just outside. He turned at the sound of the door and reached for her arm. She didn't speak until they were in the wagon again. They want to break us apart. They won't. They're trying to tear us down, Silas, all of us. You, me, the children. They won't. Clara turned to him. What if they do? What if they strip the marriage, strip the land? What if they take everything? Silas finally looked at her. His eyes, dimmed by blindness, still held their gravity. I've already lost everything once, Clara. My wife, my sight, my future. I know what that bottom feels like. But if I've got you and the children, even in a tent on the riverbank, then they haven't taken the only thing that matters. She couldn't speak after that, just reached out and took his hand. The ride home was long. The wind had picked up, sharp and dry, chasing tumbleweed across the road. At one point, Clara thought she heard another set of hooves behind them, but when she turned, the road was empty. The fear didn't leave her, not that night, not the next. But what did arrive 2 days later was something neither of them expected, a letter. Not from the judge, not from Fenwick's brother. From Marshal Kane. It read simply, "Found something, stay home, don't speak to anyone else until I arrive." He showed up by dusk. And he wasn't alone. He brought a woman with him, pale, gaunt, eyes ringed with shadows. Clara didn't recognize her, but the moment Silas heard her speak, he stiffened. "His maid," he said, "from the hotel." The woman nodded, eyes full of something like regret. "I lied," she said. "When they asked who went into Fenwick's room, I said I didn't know, but I did." "Who was it?" Clara asked. She hesitated, then said the name. Clara's knees buckled. Silas caught her before she hit the floor. Because the name wasn't hers. And it wasn't Silas's. It was someone neither of them had seen in weeks. Someone they thought had left town quietly. But now it seemed, vengeance had a different face. The name hung in the room like smoke. Clara sat slowly, her breath coming shallow. The woman, Fenwick's former maid, stood near the doorway wringing her hands, eyes flicking between Marshal Kane and the couple before her. She repeated the name, quieter this time, as though trying to lessen the blow. "Amos." Silas stood frozen, his hand still lightly on Clara's shoulder, his mouth a hard line. But Clara was unraveling inside. Amos. A boy they'd housed, a quiet drifter with eager hands and a quiet drawl. The one who'd helped Silas with the animals, who had prayed before meals and thanked her when she mended his coat. The one who disappeared a few weeks back without a word, on the very night Bryce Fenwick died. "He said he needed money," the maid whispered. "Said Fenwick promised it, but then he came out white as a sheet, shaking, told me not to tell anyone he'd been there, and the next day he was gone." Clara pressed a hand over her mouth. Silas's jaw flexed. "Where is he now?" Silas asked the marshal, voice cold as iron. Kane exhaled. "We think he's fled south. A rail conductor recognized his description 2 towns over. My deputies are already following the trail." Clara stared at the wall, her thoughts spinning. "But why?" she asked softly. "Why would he kill him?" The maid shook her head, but Marshal Kane answered. "I think he saw what kind of man Fenwick really was. Maybe he thought he was protecting you, or maybe it was something else entirely. But whatever it was, he didn't trust the law to handle it." Clara sat in silence for a long while. Then finally, quietly, she spoke. "I need to tell the children." The marshal nodded. "I'll file the report. With your names cleared, Fenwick's brother won't have a leg to stand on, not with a warrant out for Amos." He turned to go, but paused at the door. "Be careful who you bring into your home, Silas. Not everyone shows their truth right away." Silas nodded once, solemnly. Then he closed the door behind them. The cabin felt impossibly still afterward, like the air had thinned out and even the walls were holding their breath. Clara stood, her movements slow, deliberate. She walked to the back room where Sarah and Levi were stacking pine cones, their laughter light and free. "Come here," she said gently. "We need to talk." The children came, innocent faces full of trust. Clara knelt between them and pulled them close, wrapping her arms around their small shoulders. Silas watched from the doorway as Clara told them the truth, not all the harsh details, but enough. Enough that their young hearts would understand justice and fear and the weight of choices. And then later, after they were tucked in and the fire burned low, Clara found Silas sitting outside beneath the stars, the blind stretch of sky above them dark and soft. "You think we'll ever stop fighting?" she asked, sitting beside him. Silas was quiet for a long time before answering. "Maybe not, but not every fight means losing." She leaned against his side. "I just want them to have peace, to grow up with something steady." Silas turned his face slightly toward her. "They've already got something better." "What?" "Love," he said simply. "Doesn't come with peace all the time, but it holds." Clara reached for his hand and laced their fingers together. The wind brushed gently through the grass, carrying the scent of pine and earth and something new, something like spring, though the air still held a chill. Weeks passed, and slowly the world calmed. Amos was caught just over the border and brought back in chains. He didn't resist, didn't plead. In fact, the only thing he asked when they let Clara visit him was if the children were safe. "They are," she said quietly, watching him through the bars. "Because of what you did." He nodded once, eyes down. "He hurt people. I heard what he did to others before he got to you. I didn't know how else to stop him." Clara pressed her palm to the cold bars. "You should have told someone, trusted us." He didn't reply, but she saw it in his eyes, that ache of someone who'd never been taught to believe anyone would listen. Amos was sentenced, but not to hang. Judge Harrow, perhaps seeing something redemptive in the boy, sentenced him to 10 years labor under watch, with the possibility of early release. The sheriff made sure he was sent somewhere far from Fenwick's brother, far from vengeance. Life returned to a gentle rhythm. Clara's belly swelled with time. The baby moved often, restless and sure, like he already knew he was arriving in a house with too many names and hearts to fit neatly into. The children waited for him with excitement, Sarah whispering songs into Clara's lap, Jonah carving a rattle from oak, Levi practicing lullabies he barely remembered from when his own mother was alive. And Silas held her every night, pressing his cheek to her shoulder as if mapping her with his soul, because his eyes could not. One warm morning, as the sun stretched long and golden across the earth, Clara went into labor. It was not easy, it was not quick, but it was real and raw and full of a quiet strength, her strength. And when it was done, when the last cry had faded and the air was filled with the soft coo of a newborn boy, Clara held her son and wept into his hair. "Thank you," she whispered, though it wasn't clear if she was thanking the child or the Lord or the very earth itself. Silas sat beside her, reaching to gently trace the baby's cheek. "He's got your patience," he murmured, "stayed quiet this whole time." Clara laughed, exhausted and full of light. "He'll need it. He's got 3 older siblings already planning who gets to hold him first." They named him Elias, after Clara's father, a man she barely remembered but who had once sung hymns at sunrise and called her light of the morning. The house overflowed. With sound, with footsteps, with love. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now brought pies and stitched quilts. A preacher came by once a week to sit with Silas and read aloud. The children started a garden, messy, chaotic, and beautiful. And at night, when the stars were out and the world slowed to a hush, Clara would sit with Silas on the porch, baby Elias swaddled in her arms, and they would speak of what came next. Not the past, not the storms, but tomorrow. "Do you ever think," Clara asked one night, "that this isn't just chance, that all of it, your pain, my loss, even Amos, it led to this, to us?" Silas turned his face toward her. "I don't think it, I know it." And then, finally, when the wind whispered low and the fire had burned to embers, Clara rested her head on his shoulder, their baby asleep between them, and they let silence stretch deep and wide. Not empty, but full of everything they'd lost, and everything they had finally, truly found.